We've all seen the interview by now. Sat across from Gary Neville in the sort of luxurious living area that could only belong to a multimillionaire in his mid-20s, Dele Alli turned the entire poisonous narrative that surrounded him for years now completely on its head in the space of 20 minutes. Derided in the stands and in the press for the last few seasons as a man whose poor attitude and lack of discipline had squandered one of the most promising careers in a generation, here he was, warts and all, telling the world that, in fact, it was a lot more complicated than that. Here was a human being telling some all too human stories and in the process showing the lack of humanity that's often applied to people in his position. What problems can you possibly have when you're living the dream of so many and being paid this well to do it? Well, loads, as it turns out, and no amount of money or fame can offset the impact these can have on a person's life. But what got lost in the headlines about abuse, addiction and mental health was that Dele was at pains to point out that he'd only given this interview because he finally felt like he was in a strong enough place mentally to give it. "I've felt so much love and passion for football," he said, smiling for the first time in the video. "I have that back and I want to be a better player. The journey from here is exciting for me." This is why Dele Alli can be a world-class player again. First off, it's incredibly easy to forget just how good a player Dele Alli was. Arriving at Spurs in 2015, he was immediately a vital part of the first team despite still being a teenager. He missed only 8 Premier League games over the entire next 3 seasons, and by his 22nd birthday had a staggering 62 goals and assists to his name. For context, that's more than Ryan Giggs, Romelu Lukaku and Bukayo Saka at that age. And the only players ahead of him, like Rooney, Owen and Fowler, all made their debuts in the Premier League and effectively had a 3-year head start on him while he was still at MK Dons. He wasn't just an important part of the Spurs side that came close to winning both the Premier League and the Champions League, he was arguably Pochettino's most potent tactical weapon. Playing off Kane to utilise his incredible finishing ability but also dropping alongside Eriksen in the midfield to allow his outstanding technique to overload opposition midfields, what made him unlike other players in his position was his incredible reading of the game, awareness of the space around him and direct running to exploit it. Floating out in the left-hand half space to avoid his markers, his movement would open up spaces for Heung-min Son to burst into, while Harry Kane, occupying the centre-backs, would often leave a similar space for him. Positioned on the opposite side of central zones to Christian Eriksen, he made a trademark of arriving late into the back post area to meet one of the Danes' deliveries, with Kane having drawn a marker away to the front. His performances were eye-catching, his goals often defied belief, and in 2018 he was described by his manager as the best young player in Europe. Few disagreed, but it was this very season when things started to unravel for him. After being a near ever-present since his arrival, he picked up 6 separate injuries over the course of the 2018-2019 season, and missed a staggering 22 games over a 14-week period. Primarily reoccurring in his hamstrings, these injuries have resurfaced every season since, from minor niggles to serious strains, and were one of the major reasons for both his decline in form and his fading influence in the Tottenham team. We don't need to make this a detailed history lesson, but over the next 4 seasons he fell out of favour, fell out of the club, fell out of the country, and even ended the most recent campaign back at Everton after Besiktas looked to cancel his loan there rather than activate the clause to make it permanent. From the golden boy of English football to the most astonishing decline in value arguably ever seen, this was the simple story of Dele Alli, and it was one that has been cemented by years of surface-level punditry that accused him of lacking desire, of taking his eye off the ball, of losing focus, and of not being professional. There are now several post-match discussions on Sky's own YouTube channel that have aged incredibly poorly. But, as Dele himself has said, the interview isn't about the past. He doesn't, as he put it, want to keep driving down the road looking in the rearview mirror. He wants to play football again, and he wants to exceed the levels he's previously attained. And that, from the position he's in now, does seem like an enormous distance away, but it's still just 27 and a major surgery designed to fix a number of injury issues now behind him. It might not be as impossible as it seems. What made him such a special player was his on-field intelligence. Yes, his physical standards need to be high to allow him to best exploit that, contract, but if his mind is, as he claims, in the right place, that vision and clarity is something that should return naturally. Looking back at his performances in recent years, it's very easy to see the picture of a distracted player no longer having the instincts that made him so good. He looked lost on the field because, well, he was. But there's a very telling performance for him during his short time in Turkey. In September of last year, in a 3-2 away win for Besiktas against Ankaragücü, something seemed to click for him. After an opening period littered with ineffectual touches, stray passes and a failure to really influence the game, he suddenly gambles on a run to the back post. The ball falls kindly for him and he darts into the space to score his first goal for the club. What followed, however briefly, was a 30-minute spell in both halves that looked like something of the Dele of old. His touch was more assured, he was asking for the ball in tighter and more dangerous areas, he wins a number of fouls in great positions, he plays a teammate in with a deft back heel. In the white of the Turkish club, one could even be forgiven for thinking they were watching an old Spurs game. But as the second half wore on and a few passes went amiss, that lack of focus again started to rear its head and he was ultimately substituted in the closing stages. A fleeting upturn in a single game it may well have been, but still an indication that there is a top player in there when the required clarity returns. If he is, as he says, in a good place mentally, he might not be as far off his old levels as people will so readily assume. But his main issue, though, is going to be game time. One thing that's emerged subsequent to the interview is that his position at Everton is actively being disincentivised by Tottenham. In a mere 7 more appearances, they'll be due another £10 million owing to the terms of his transfer. And that is a fee the Merseyside club are very keen to avoid in their current financial situation. For all Spurs have rallied around their former player in the wake of the interview, waiving this clause would do far more for him than any supportive tweets ever could. While Dele himself has spoken warmly of the way Everton and Sean Dyche have handled both his mental and physical health, it seems unlikely that he'll be a part of their first team plans next season. Both Birmingham and West Brom have reportedly approached Everton about giving him the game time if they're still willing to shoulder the bulk of his wages. To some, this will represent yet another element of his decline, but this is a player who started his career in the Football League and knows exactly how important it can be to a player's development. Rather than simply being minutes in the legs or a way to wind down his Everton contract, a year in the Championship could be perfect to resharpen his tools and remind himself of the ability he possesses. One needs look no further than Alexander Mitrovic, whose 2020-2021 Premier League campaign with Fulham yielded just 4 goals in 31 games, but after a year with them back in the Championship was averaging better than a goal a game before his hefty ban last season. Likewise, the crucial difference maker between Patrick Bamford's rubbish Premier League season with Middlesbrough and his astonishing one with Leeds was a year between spent in the Championship. Newcastle fans will happily tell you that John Joe Shelby was part of the reason they got relegated in 2016, but 2 years later they were banging on the door to get him an England call-up. So, what does the future hold for what was one of England's most promising stars? Well, the interview with the overlap was an important first step, and hopefully his talking about what he's been through will help others in a similar situation. But for his career, it's the talking on the pitch that now has to follow. Wherever that starts remains to be seen, but if he can get back to being even half the player we saw during his time at Spurs, there's no reason that can't lead back to the very, very top level.